The plains stretched wide under a sky the color of faded denim. Out there, where silence was heavier than church bells and the wind carried secrets older than memory, a cowboy lived alone. His name was Elijah Kane. Once, men had feared his hand and his revolver. But that was long ago, back when he was another man, one built for war, for bounties, for blood spilled in the dust. Now he lived in peace, or what passed for it in the frontier. His ranch was small, barely enough to graze, a few head of cattle and keep the roof steady above his tired shoulders. The land didn't give much, but Elijah asked for nothing more. He woke with the dawn, worked until sweat darkened his shirt, and ended the day by the fire, his boots crossed by the hearth, listening to the crackle of wood and the whisper of the prairie night. No wife, no children, just silence, the earth, and the ghosts he never spoke of. To most folks, Elijah was a shadow that had retreated from the world. He rode into town maybe once a month, buying flour, salt, ammunition, and leaving before anyone asked questions. The saloon girls whispered about his past, and the sheriff nodded at him like a man who knew exactly what Elijah had been capable of but was grateful he'd buried that part of himself. But the prairie has a cruel way of stirring up what a man tries hardest to forget. And Elijah's peace was never meant to last. It happened on a night when the wind carried the scent of rain and thunder rolled low like drums far away. He had just set down his coffee when the dogs started barking, wild, frantic, their growls, breaking the silence like gunshots. Elijah stood, reaching for the rifle leaned against the wall. Out here, barking at night rarely meant anything good. Rustlers, coyotes, or worse, the desperate kind of men who came with knives in their belts and hunger in their eyes. But when he opened the door, he didn't find men. He found two girls. They couldn't have been more than 15 or 16. Their dark hair was matted with dust, their dresses torn, their eyes wide with fear. They stood there in the lantern light, breathing heavy like they had been running for miles. One clutched the other's hand so tight it looked painful, and the younger one trembled as the older pushed her forward, as if daring Elijah to send them away. For a moment, neither spoke. The rain began to fall in slow drops, and the thunder rumbled closer. Elijah's dogs paced, growling, confused by these strange visitors. Finally, the older girl found her voice. "Shelter," she said, her English broken but firm. "Please, shelter." Her voice cracked on the last word, but her eyes didn't waver. Elijah studied them, saw the cuts on their arms, the dirt under their fingernails, the wild terror that only comes from being hunted. He knew right then, this was no accident. Something, or someone, was after them. And as the rain began to pour, Elijah Kane had to make a choice. Close the door, keep his peace intact, or open it, and let trouble ride straight into his life again. The girls stared at him, their breath clouding in the cold night air. For a long, heavy silence, all that moved was the storm. Then Elijah sighed, lowered his rifle, and stepped aside. "Get in," he said. The two native girls slipped past him, their shoulders sagging with relief. But Elijah knew the storm outside wasn't half as dangerous as the storm that had just walked into his home. And for the first time in years, the cowboy felt the old weight return, the weight of fate tightening its grip, the quiet before a storm that no man could outride. The rain drummed harder on the roof as the door closed behind them. The cabin smelled of smoke, leather, and iron, the kind of place built for survival, not for comfort. Elijah set the rifle back against the wall, but his hand lingered on it, longer than necessary. Years of instinct whispered to him, trouble never knocks without reason. The two girls stood near the fire, their wet hair dripping, their thin dresses clinging to their small frames. They looked fragile, but Elijah had seen fragility before, and he knew the difference between weakness and exhaustion. These girls weren't weak. They were running from something something that had left its claws in them. He lit another lantern, filling the cabin with a warmer glow. Their faces came clearer, young, yes, but marked by hardship. The older one's cheek was bruised, swollen purple beneath her eye. The younger's knees were scraped raw, her palms torn as though she had stumbled through rocks or brambles in her flight. Elijah poured water into a tin cup and set it on the table. "Drink," he said simply. The younger girl looked to the elder, waiting. When the older gave a small nod, she stepped forward, trembling fingers curling around the cup. She drank too fast, water spilling down her chin, and Elijah felt a knot tighten in his chest. Hunger, thirst, and fear, that kind of desperation, didn't happen without a long road of suffering behind it. The older one spoke again, her voice sharper this time, more controlled. "My name, Naira," she said, pressing a hand to her chest. Then she touched her sister's shoulder gently. "This is Ayanna." Elijah gave a slow nod, his eyes narrowing. The names carried the weight of the plains, of old tribes pushed off their land, of blood spilled in treaties never honored. They sat in silence for a long moment, broken only by the fire crackling and the storm raging outside. Elijah wanted to ask questions, but he knew too well what it meant to force words out of someone who had been running for their life. So instead he waited. It was Ayanna, the younger, who finally spoke in a whisper so soft Elijah almost missed it. "They killed them," she said. Elijah's jaw tightened. He set his coffee down slowly, eyes fixed on the girl. "Who?" he asked. Naira reached over and took her sister's hand, squeezing it as if to silence her. But Ayanna's words tumbled out anyway, the kind of words that once spoken could never be taken back. White men, soldiers. They came to the village, burned it. Elijah's chest went cold. His mind conjured up images he knew too well. Villages set aflame, women screaming, the air filled with gunpowder and smoke. He had ridden with men like that once, men who believed that a badge or a flag excused cruelty. He had watched atrocities dressed up as justice. And he had left that life because the stench of it clung to him long after the gunfire ceased. He forced his voice steady. "Why come here? To me?" Naira's eyes flickered to the door, then back to Elijah. Her English was broken, but her meaning, sharp as a knife. "They follow. We run. No safe place. You, only house, only fire." It was then Elijah realized the truth. They hadn't chosen his cabin by chance. They had stumbled onto his land in their desperate flight, but perhaps fate had carried their feet the rest of the way. The storm outside howled, branches whipping against the roof. But the cabin's silence was heavier still. Elijah looked at them, two children really, their lives shattered in a way no one that young should know, and felt something stirring inside him. A memory long buried. He remembered another night, long ago, when he'd ridden into a burning town, not to save, but to kill. Back then, he was on the side of the destroyers. He had watched innocent eyes beg for mercy and turned his face away. He had told himself it was just war, just orders, just another payday. But the ghosts had never let him sleep, and now here they were again, two pairs of eyes, staring at him, asking for something he wasn't sure he had left to give. Finally, Elijah stood and walked to the window. Beyond the glass, the prairie stretched, endless and black under the storm. But somewhere out there, beyond the rain, men were hunting. He could feel it the way a wolf feels other predators in the dark. "They'll come," he said, half to himself, half to them. "If they want you that bad, they'll come. And if they find you here." His voice trailed off, but Naira understood. She stood straighter, her chin lifting with quiet defiance. "Then fight," she said. The word hung in the air like a challenge, like a spark waiting for tinder. Elijah turned from the window and met her gaze. For a long, heavy silence, the only sound was the rain hammering down. Then slowly, almost against his own will, he nodded. "Then fight," he repeated. And with that, the peace he had built brick by brick over the years was gone, washed away, like sand under floodwater. The storm outside was only the beginning. The storm broke before dawn. The rain faded into mist, and the plains glistened silver beneath a pale, rising sun. Elijah Kane hadn't slept a wink. He sat by the window, rifle across his knees, watching the horizon as the two girls slept huddled near the fire like frightened fawns. Every sound outside set his nerves on edge: the creak of the barn door in the wind, the restless lowing of the cattle, the snapping of branches in the distance. Years of bloodshed had given him instincts he wished he could bury, but now those instincts stirred alive again, sharp as ever. He knew men were coming, and sure enough, just as the sun broke the clouds, he saw them. 5 riders, black silhouettes cresting the ridge to the east. They moved slow, deliberate, not searching, tracking. Even from a distance, Elijah could tell. The way they rode wasn't casual. Their heads shifted side to side, scanning the land with the patience of hunters who knew their prey was close. Elijah felt his jaw clench. His hands gripped the rifle tighter. He had hoped maybe, just maybe, the storm had bought the girls enough of a head start. But fate never dealt mercy in the West. He stood and went to the fire, crouching beside the girls. "Wake up," he said, voice low but firm. Naira stirred first, blinking against the dim light. Ayanna followed, rubbing her eyes, looking so small Elijah felt a pang in his chest. "They're here," he said simply. The words seemed to fall heavy on the wooden floorboards. Naira stiffened, her hand tightening protectively around her sister's arm. Ayanna whispered, almost too faint to hear, "They will burn again. They always burn." Elijah placed a rough hand on her shoulder, steadying her. "Not this place," he said. "Not while I draw breath." He stood and moved to the cabinet near the door, pulling it open to reveal a row of weapons hidden beneath old cloth. A shotgun, 2 pistols, boxes of ammunition. He hadn't touched them in years, hadn't wanted to. Each weapon felt like a weight from a past life. But as his fingers brushed the steel, the old familiarity returned, like shaking hands with an old enemy you once called brother. He loaded each weapon methodically, his movements steady, practiced. The girls watched him, wide-eyed. Ayanna clutched Naira's arm, whispering in their language, fear spilling from her lips like a prayer. "Elijah," Naira said, her accent wrapping awkwardly around his name. "Why help us? They kill for us. They kill for nothing." Elijah paused, shotgun half-loaded. He looked at her for a long moment, his weathered face hard, but his eyes carrying the weight of something deeper. "Because I've stood where they stand," he said quietly. "And I've seen too much burn." For a heartbeat, silence reigned. Then the dogs outside barked, low, sharp, the kind of bark that meant strangers were near. Elijah moved to the window again. The riders had come down from the ridge. Now he could see them clearer. They wore pieces of army coats, some torn, some stained. Their faces were rough, cruel, men who had once served under the flag, now twisting its authority into something uglier. One rode with a torch strapped to his saddle, another with a rope coiled across his chest. Their eyes scanned the land like hawks circling over carrion. The leader rode at the front, a broad man with a gray beard and a scar running from his ear to his chin. His hat was low, shadowing his face, but Elijah didn't need to see his eyes to know the kind of man he was. He carried himself with the weight of cruelty worn proud like a badge. They stopped at the edge of Elijah's land. Even from the distance, he could see them talking, pointing toward the cabin. One dismounted, crouching low to the ground, tracking, following footprints. "They know," Elijah muttered under his breath. He turned back to the girls. "No noise. No crying. Stay low." Naira nodded, pulling her sister closer. Elijah moved toward the door, shotgun in hand, his boots heavy on the wooden floor. He could feel his heart beating, not with fear, but with the slow, steady rhythm of a man slipping back into the skin he had tried so long to shed. The riders began to approach. Slowly at first, then with more certainty, their horses stepping into the wet earth, their eyes fixed on the cabin ahead. Elijah breathed deep. The land had given him peace for years, but now it was calling him to war again. As the hoofbeats drew closer, he whispered to himself, words no one else could hear. Lord, forgive me, but this land ain't theirs to burn. And with that, Elijah Kane stepped out onto his porch, into the gray dawn, the shotgun cradled in his arms, his shadow long against the wet earth. The riders saw him then, and for a moment, the world held its breath. The air was damp with the smell of wet earth and burned wood carried on the wind. Elijah stood tall on his porch, the shotgun heavy in his arms, his figure cut sharp against the pale morning sky. The riders slowed their pace, the rhythmic thud of hooves growing softer as they drew near, until the sound of dripping water from the barn roof was louder than their approach. 5 men, hard men, faces weathered by sun and cruelty, eyes that had seen blood and hadn't blinked. Their coats were mismatched, some tattered pieces of army blue, others patched with buffalo hide and stained with grime. These were not soldiers anymore, not in any honorable sense. They were carrion feeders wearing scraps of uniforms to justify their raids. The leader, the broad man with the gray beard and the scar splitting his face, raised a hand. The others reined in their horses. He studied Elijah from beneath the brim of his hat. His mouth curled into something that wasn't a smile, but close enough to mock one. "Well now," the scarred man drawled, voice rough like gravel dragged over stone. "Didn't reckon to see a ghost out here." Elijah didn't answer. He just shifted the shotgun slightly, the movement calm, deliberate. His silence was its own language, one that men like these understood. The scarred man chuckled, glancing back at his riders. "Don't you boys know who that is?" he asked them, pointing his chin toward Elijah. "That there's Kane, Elijah Kane. Used to ride with Captain Horner's men. Ain't that right?" The others muttered, some nodding, some narrowing their eyes as if trying to match the name to old whispers. One spat into the mud. "Heard he put down 20 men outside Abilene," one said. "Closer to 30, another muttered. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The leader leaned forward in his saddle, the leather creaking under his weight. "Funny thing, though. A man like you, all the blood you spilled, and here you are, hiding out in the dirt with cattle and chickens. Almost sad." His eyes flicked toward the cabin, sharp and deliberate. "Course, that ain't why we're here." Elijah's grip tightened around the shotgun, but his face remained stone. "Then say why you are," he said, his voice low, steady. The scarred man tilted his head. "Couple runaways, girls, saw their tracks leadin' this way. Now, I don't mind if they stumbled in by mistake. They ain't worth the trouble for you. Just hand 'em over and we'll be gone before the sun's high." The words slid across the air like a blade. The riders shifted, one of them adjusting the rope coiled on his shoulder, another fingering the torch strapped to his saddle. Inside, the cabin, behind the thin wooden door, Naira and Ayana crouched low, listening. The younger girl's breath came quick and shallow. Naira held her close, her other hand gripping a small knife she had found on Elijah's table, though she knew it would do little good against men like these. Elijah didn't move, his eyes fixed on the scarred man, unblinking. "They're just girls," he said. "Children." The scarred man's mouth twitched. "Children," he scoffed. "They're savages, same as their kin. You know that better than anyone. Don't play righteous now, Kane." For a flicker of a moment, Elijah's composure cracked. Ghosts stirred behind his eyes. Faces from the past, villages in flames, orders shouted across the smoke. He remembered the helpless stares of mothers, the cries of children. He had stood silent then. He had told himself it wasn't his burden. But not now. Not again. He stepped forward, one boot sinking into the wet earth of the yard. The dogs at his feet growled, hackles raised. "They ain't yours to take," Elijah said. The scarred man's grin widened, though it carried no warmth. "Everything. Out here's ours to take," he replied. His voice hardened, steel beneath the mockery. "I'll give you one chance, Cain. One. Hand them over, and we ride away. Otherwise—" He let the word linger, gesturing lazily to the torch on the saddle. The rope coiled across a chest, the pistols at their hips. Elijah's voice came low, like a rumble of thunder. "You bring fire to my land. You won't ride away." The riders shifted uneasily, sensing the weight of his words. The scarred man's smile faded just enough for the tension to settle thick in the morning air. For a long moment, the world stood still. Even the wind seemed to pause, holding its breath. Then the scarred man leaned back in his saddle, eyes narrowing, his tone almost amused. "Guess the ghost still got some teeth," he muttered. He glanced back at his men. "Circle. Wide. We'll smoke him out if we have to." The riders began to spread, slow and deliberate, like wolves tightening around a wounded animal. Elijah watched them, calm, steady, though inside his heart beat hard and fast. He could feel the weight of the cabin behind him, the two girls, fragile and terrified, waiting for him to stand, waiting for him to prove that the world wasn't all fire and ruin. He raised the shotgun slightly, barrel gleaming in the gray light. His voice carried across the yard, cold and certain. "You make one more step," he said, "and the first man I see drops dead." The scarred man studied him for a long, tense silence. Then, slowly, his grin returned. "Well now," he drawled. "Looks like the quiet life's over, Cain," and with that, the stillness shattered. The first shot cracked the morning silence. It wasn't Elijah's. One of the riders, too eager to wait for orders, raised his pistol and fired. The bullet split the air, striking the wooden beam of the porch and showering Elijah with splinters. The dogs barked madly, teeth bared, as the ranch seemed to wake in violence. Elijah didn't flinch. He shouldered the shotgun and fired once, the blast rolling like thunder across the plains. The eager rider tumbled from his saddle, his chest torn wide, hitting the mud with a heavy, lifeless thud. His horse screamed and bolted. The smell of gunpowder filled the wet morning air. "Kill him!" the scarred man roared. The yard erupted. Pistols cracked. Horses reared. Elijah rolled from the porch, hitting the mud hard, shotgun empty, but his hands already moving for the Colt at his hip. He fired fast, 2 shots snapping through the gray dawn. Another rider screamed, clutching his neck before falling face first into the muck. Inside the cabin, the girls screamed. Naira pulled Ayana down, shielding her with her body as bullets splintered the walls. The fire roared in the hearth, sparks jumping high as the cabin shuddered under the gunfire. Elijah moved like a man years younger, like the warrior he once was. He dove behind the water trough, mud soaking his coat, bullets whipping past his head. He breathed steady, eyes sharp, counting each gunshot, each pause. 2 riders circled toward the barn, trying to flank him. Elijah popped up, his Colt steady, and dropped one with a clean shot through the chest. The other ducked behind a fence post, firing wild, splinters spraying the air. Then came the scarred man's voice, booming across the yard. "Burn him out!" Elijah's blood ran cold. He saw one of the riders rip the torch from his saddle, striking it against flint until fire licked bright. "No," Elijah hissed. He broke cover, sprinting across the yard, mud flying under his boots. The rider with the torch raised it high, grinning cruelly, about to hurl it toward the cabin. Elijah's revolver barked once. The man's grin froze, then vanished as the bullet tore through his skull. He fell backward, torch dropping into the mud, sputtering in the wet earth, but the move cost Elijah. As he turned, Another rider's bullet seared across his arm, ripping through flesh. He staggered, teeth gritted, the Colt slipping for a moment in his blood-slick hand. The scarred man spurred his horse forward, pistol drawn. He fired once, the shot grazing Elijah's hat, snapping it from his head. The second shot would have ended him, if Elijah hadn't rolled into the mud, firing back from the ground. The shot struck the horse instead. The beast screamed, reared, and toppled sideways, crushing the rider beneath it. The scarred man bellowed, pinned, his pistol lost in the muck. Elijah scrambled to his feet, panting, blood running down his arm, his chest heaving. 2 riders were dead, one pinned, another bleeding out near the fence. Only one remained, A. Youngest of the bunch, eyes wide with fear, rifle shaking in his hands. He raised it at Elijah, but his grip faltered. His face was pale, sweat dripping down. He looked at the dead around him, at the scarred man writhing under his horse, and his courage crumbled. The rifle clattered to the ground. He kicked his heels into his horse and rode hard, fleeing across the open plain, not daring to look back. Elijah stood in the mud, chest heaving, revolver still raised, eyes locked on the horizon, where the last rider disappeared. Silence returned, broken only by the groans of the scarred man trapped beneath his horse. The man spat blood, glaring up at Elijah, with hate burning bright. "You think you saved him?" he rasped. "You think this ends here? There'll be more, always more." Elijah approached, slow, deliberate, revolver still steady. He looked down at the scarred man, his shadow falling over him. For a long moment he said nothing. His face was carved stone, unreadable. Then his voice came low, like the growl of distant thunder. "Not today." The revolver cracked one last time. The scarred man's head fell back into the mud, eyes empty. The struggle ended. Elijah stood still, smoke curling from his Colt, rain beginning. Again in a soft drizzle. Around him the yard was a graveyard, mud soaked with blood, bodies lying twisted, horses scattered. The quiet ranch he had built, the peace he had carved out of the wilderness, was gone. The cabin door creaked open. Naira stood there, face pale but fierce, her arm around Ayanna, who clung to her sister. Their eyes met Elijah's, wide, searching, terrified, and yet filled with something else too. Hope. For a long moment, Elijah said nothing. He holstered his revolver, the sound heavy in the silence. He looked at the dead, at the rain washing blood into the dirt, and then back at the 2 girls. He knew what it meant now. There was no going back to peace. The fire had found him again, just as it always had. But this time he wouldn't turn. "Away! Pack what you need," Elijah said quietly, his voice steady, carrying the weight of decision. "We ride at first light." Naira frowned. "Where?" Elijah glanced east, toward the endless plains, his eyes dark as the storm clouds rolling back in. "Where they won't find you. Where no more torches burn." The girls nodded, clinging to each other. And as the rain fell harder, washing away the blood but not the memory, Elijah Kane knew that the quiet life was over. The cowboy who had buried his past was gone. In his place stood a man of war once more,